Coffee Break Collection 16. Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Circumstantial account of the life, trial, piracies, and execution of Captain John Kidd, who was hanged at Execution Dock. By William Jackson. The case of Captain Kidd, while in agitation, engaged the attention of the public in a very eminent degree, though the man himself was one of the most contemptible of the human race. The town of Greenock in Scotland gave birth to Captain Kidd, who was bred to the sea, and having quitted his native country, he resided at New York, where he became owner of a small vessel, with which he traded among the pirates, obtained a thorough knowledge of their haunts, and could give a better account of them than any other person whatever. He was neither remarkable for the excess of his courage nor for his want of it. In a word, his ruling passion appeared to be avarice, and to this was owing his connection with the pirates. When Kidd was in company with these abandoned people, he used to converse and act as they did, yet at other times he would make singular professions of honesty, and intimate how easy a matter it would be to extirpate these people, and prevent their making further depredations. His frequent remarks of this kind engaged the notice of several considerable planters, who, forming a more favourable idea of him than his true character would warrant, procured him the patronage with which he was afterwards honoured. Before we enter into further particulars respecting this man, it will be proper to say something of the situation of public affairs previous to, and at the time he began to grow conspicuous. For years past great complaints had been made of the piracies committed in the West Indies, which had been greatly encouraged by some of the inhabitants of North America, on account of the advantage that could be made by the purchase of effects thus fraudulently obtained. This coming to the knowledge of King William III., he, in the year 1695, bestowed the government of New England and New York on the Earl of Bellomont, an Irish nobleman of distinguished character and abilities. As soon as his Majesty had conferred this honour on Lord Bellomont, his lordship began to consider of the most effectual method to redress the evils complained of, and he represented to Colonel Livingston, a gentleman who had great property in New York, that some proper steps should be taken to obviate the evils so long complained of. Just at this juncture Captain Kidd was arrived from New York in a sloop of his own. Him, therefore, the Colonel mentioned to Lord Bellomont as a bold and daring man, who was very fit to be employed against the pirates, as he was perfectly well acquainted with the places which they resorted at. This plan met with the fullest approbation of his lordship, who, knowing how desirous the king was that this nest of pirates should be destroyed, mentioned the affair to his Majesty, who greatly applauded the design and recommended it to the notice of the Board of Admiralty. The commissioners likewise approved it, but such were then the hurry and confusion of public affairs, that though the design was approved, no steps were taken towards carrying it into execution. The transactions on this head being imparted to Colonel Livingston, he made an application to Lord Bellomont, and informed him that as the affair would not well admit of delay, it was worthy of being undertaken by some private persons of rank and distinction, and carried into execution at their own expense, notwithstanding public encouragement was denied it. Lord Bellomont approved of this project, but it was attended with considerable difficulty. At length, however, the Lord Chancellor Somers, the Duke of Shrewsbury, the Earl of Romney, the Earl of Oxford, and some other persons, with Colonel Livingston and Captain Kidd, agreed to raise £6,000 for the expense of the voyage, and the colonel and captain were to have a fifth of the profits of the whole undertaking. This plan was so highly approved of by King William, who thought it would produce such great advantages to his subjects, that he promised to contribute to its success, and therefore a reserve was agreed to be made of a 10th part of the effects seized from the pirates for the use of his Majesty. But after the contract was concluded, the king could not spare his share of the money, and therefore the whole was advanced by the above-mentioned persons. Matters being thus far adjusted, a commission in the usual form was granted to Captain Kidd to take and seize pirates and bring them to justice, but there was no special clause or proviso to restrain his conduct or regulate the mode of his proceeding. Kidd was known to Lord Bellomont, and another gentleman presented him to Lord Romney. With regard to the other parties concerned, he was wholly unacquainted with them, and so ill was this affair conducted, that he had no private instruction how to act, but received his sailing orders from Lord Bellomont, the purport of which was, that he should act agreeable to the letter of his commission. Accordingly a vessel was purchased and manned, and received the name of the Adventure Galley, and in this Captain Kidd sailed for New York towards the close of the year 1695, and in his passage made a prize of a French ship. From New York he sailed to the Madeira Islands, thence to Bonavisto and St. Jago, and from this last place to Madagascar. He now began to cruise at the entrance of the Red Sea, but not being successful in those latitudes, he sailed to Calicut, and there took a ship of 150 tons burden, which he carried to Madagascar and disposed of there. Having sold his prize, he again put to sea, and at the expiration of 5 weeks took the Quetta Merchant, a ship of above 400 tons burden, the master of which was an Englishman named Wright, who had 2 Dutch mates on board and a French gunner, but the crew consisted of Moors, natives of Africa, and were about 90 in number. He carried this ship to St. Mary's, near Madagascar, where he burnt the Adventure Galley belonging to his owners, and divided the lading of the Quetta Merchant with his crew, taking 40 shares to himself. They then went on board the last mentioned ship and sailed for the West Indies. It is uncertain whether the inhabitants of the West India Islands knew that Kidd was a pirate, but he was refused refreshments at Anguilla and St. Thomas's, and therefore sailed to Mona, between Porto Rico and Hispaniola, where, through the management of an Englishman named Bolton, he obtained a supply of provisions from Curacao. He now bought a sloop of Bolton, in which he stowed great parts of his ill-gotten effects, and left the Quetta Merchant with 18 of the ship's company in Bolton's care. While at St. Mary's 90 men of Kidd's crew left him and went on board the Mocha Merchant, an East India ship which had just then commenced pirate. Kidd now sailed in the sloop and touched at several places, where he disposed of a great part of his cargo, and then steered for Boston in New England. In the interim Bolton sold the Quetta Merchant to the Spaniards, and immediately sailed as a passenger in a ship for Boston, where he arrived a considerable time before Kidd, and gave information of what happened to Lord Bellomont, then the resident governor. Kidd, therefore, on his arrival, was seized by order of his lordship, when all he had to urge in his defence was that he thought the Quetta Merchant was a lawful prize, as she was manned with Moors, though there was no kind of proof that this vessel had committed any act of piracy. Upon this the Earl of Bellomont immediately dispatched an account to England of the circumstances that had arisen, and requested that a ship might be sent for Kidd, who had committed several other notorious acts of piracy. The ship Rochester was accordingly sent to bring him to England, but this vessel happening to be disabled was obliged to return, a circumstance which greatly increased a public clamour which had for some time subsisted respecting this affair. It is not to be doubted but this clamour took its rise from party prejudice, yet it was carried to such a height that the members of Parliament for several places were instructed to move the House for an inquiry into the affair, and accordingly it was moved in the House of Commons that the letters patent granted to the Earl of Bellomont and others respecting the goods taken from pirates were dishonourable to the King, against the law of nations, contrary to the laws and statutes of this realm, an invasion of property, and destructive to commerce. Though a negative was put on this motion, yet the enemies of Lord Somers and the Earl of Oxford continued to charge those noblemen with giving countenance to pirates, and it was even insinuated that the Earl of Bellomont was not less culpable than the actual offenders. Another motion was accordingly made in the House of Commons to address his Majesty, that Kidd might not be tried till the next session of Parliament, and that the Earl of Bellomont might be directed to send home all examinations and other papers relative to the affair. This motion was carried, and the King complied with the request which was made. As soon as Kidd arrived in England, he was sent for and examined at the bar of the House of Commons, with a view to fix part of his guilt on the parties who had been concerned in sending him on the expedition, but nothing arose to criminate any of those distinguished persons. Kidd, who was in some degree intoxicated, made a very contemptible appearance at the bar of the House, on which a member who had been one of the most earnest to have him examined, violently exclaimed, "Damn this fellow! I thought he had been only a knave, but unfortunately he happens to be a fool likewise." Kidd was at length tried at the Old Bailey, and was convicted on the clearest evidence, but neither at that time nor afterwards charged any of his employers with being privy to his infamous proceedings. He was hanged at Execution Dock on the 23rd day of May 1701, but a circumstance happened at his execution that will be worthy of recital. After he had been tied up to the gallows, the rope broke, and he fell to the ground. But being immediately tied up again, the Ordinary, who had before exhorted him, desired to speak with him once more, and on this second application entreated him to make the most careful use of the few further moments thus providentially allotted him for the final preparation of his soul to meet its important change. These exhortations appeared to have the wished-for effect, and he was left professing his charity to all the world and his hopes of salvation through the merits of his Redeemer. In this manner ended the life of Captain Kidd, a man who, if he had entertained a proper regard to the welfare of the public, or even to his own advantage, might have become a useful member of society instead of a disgrace to it. The opportunities he had obtained of acquiring a complete knowledge of the haunts of the pirates rendered him one of the most proper men in the world to have extirpated this nest of villains, but his own avarice defeated the generous views of some of the greatest and most distinguished men of the age in which he lived. Hence we may learn the destructive nature of avarice, which generally counteracts all its own purposes. Captain Kidd might have acquired a fortune and rendered material service to his country, in a point the most essential to its interests, but he appeared to be dead to all those generous sensations which do honour to humanity, and materially injured his country, while he was bringing final disgrace on himself. The history of this wretched malefactor will effectually impress on the mind of the reader the truth of the old observation, that honesty is the best policy. Henceforth let honour's path be trod, nor villains seek in vain to mock the sacred laws of God, and give their neighbours pain. End of the circumstantial account of the life, trial, piracies, and execution of Captain John Kidd, who was hanged at Execution Dock. Recording by Philip Gould.